So, hello everyone, and welcome to our ninth episode of Agree to Disagree About Gender. I'm Laura Turgonic,
I'm Yvette.
and we're here today with our special guest, Jon McNee. The reason I'm having Jon on, for those of you who might be unfamiliar with him, you may be more familiar with his work. Jon has a Substack called Dispatches from the Autism Wars, and he also hosts a podcast called Christianity on the Spectrum. And I became familiar with Jon when on my Substack feed, I came across this really fascinating essay that I found to be really poignant when I read it. And it was something that, at first when I read the title, it sort of was something I was I'm not going to say disinclined to read, but I knew it was going to be a challenge because the title of this essay, which is going to be something that's going to be the focus of our discussion today, is called I Had Teenage Gender Dysphoria. Now I don't, and it feels weird. And I really do recommend that anyone who watches this episode take a moment to read this essay afterwards, because in this, Jon talks about his experience as someone who, with autism, who comes from a religious background, who also, during his teenage years, experienced gender dysphoria, which is obviously very similar to my story. Obviously, as you can see just by observing today, the outcomes were a bit different. And I think there's a lot to explore into sort of how this plays out. So just to give you a little bit of background about Jon, Jon is an independent autism researcher who focuses primarily on Christian and ex-Christian online autistic subcommunities. His research covers data mining from over 26,000 online autistic personas and over 600 long-form interviews and 15,000 survey responses, which sounds to me like one of the more comprehensive data sets in this area. As I mentioned, he has a podcast where he talks about his research called Christianity on the Spectrum, and a Substack, Dispatches from the Autism Wars, where he talks more about his research. So, with that, I would like to welcome Jon to our podcast.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. So, I want to just, start out with the first question. So, before we get into the essay, just tell us a little bit about just sort of who you are and what you're mostly up to.
Yeah, so my name is Jon. In my day job, I work in cybersecurity. I'm a computer engineer with a background in digital forensics, and I used to be in the military, and now I'm not. And now I work in cybersecurity. So take a guess at what I did while I was in the military, and that's about as much as I typically say about the topic. I'm Canadian.
Yay!
I come from Saskatchewan and was raised Mennonite Brethren. Most people don't know what that means, so it just is functionally evangelical conservative. And yeah, I also was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome when I was 16. I probably would have been diagnosed with it much earlier if I didn't come from a small rural community. But I got the diagnosis when I was 16. I excitedly went to tell all my teachers this shocking revelation, and they all kind of looked at me like, "Oh, you didn't know?" And so yeah, I started my research project after I deconverted from Christianity and started to realize that there were a lot of other autistic people who were like me who also deconverted, and I thought this is a really weird thing that's happened. And because we all had very similar stories, and I thought there must be some sort of reason behind this because I met like 10 other people who had almost identical stories to me, and I thought this can't just be an anomaly in my little microcosm. I'm going to go figure it out. So I looked at all the peer review research that there was about autism and religiosity, and I found their explanations were uh, less satisfying than I would have hoped. And so I thought, I'm a computer engineer. I know how to solve this problem. I'm just going to data mine it myself. And that started a 12-year long longitudinal research project, sort of incidentally. Autistic people tend to develop restrictive, narrow interests on certain things, and mine became autism and religiosity. Eventually, I reconverted back to Christianity, which I didn't expect to do, but now I'm back. And then when I left the military, I was like, I can finally have a public persona. I should do something with all this research and data that I've been collecting because I'm sure I'm not the only one who finds it interesting. And so I've been just periodically publishing about the various things that I found and the oddities and anomalies that you get with the autism spectrum, and more specifically, the autism spectrum when it interacts with Christianity in the Anglosphere. So that's that.
Cool. I want to take it back to something we said earlier in the conversation, which is, and sort of, tying into you recognizing, you're recognizing your autism. which came late, which isn't unusual, especially in people who are high functioning. And I want to bring it into this conversation about dysphoria because there's a lot of emerging research that does suggest that there is some connection between, you know, either developing gender dysphoria or having gender dysphoria and having autism or autistic spectrum or having autistic um, traits. Um, so, as someone who's lived through both those experiences, um, what is your best perspective as far as like what is it about autism or what is it about gender dysphoria that makes these two things run concurrently? And does one sort of uh, are they kind of both like sort of uh, you know like rats chasing each other in a circle, or is it really something that that one is causing the other, one predisposes to the other?
Yeah, so I'd like to preface before I say this. No one actually knows the answer to this question.
Well, that's why
This
I'm asking
is
you.
yeah, this is a area of speculation. I'm doing my best to try to reconstruct it, but I don't actually know the answer to this, and there could be many different potential answers to this question. And so do take what I'm about to say with a grain of salt. Don't don't run with this and say, this is the answer. So there are a few things. I think these, which came first, the dysphoria or the autism, is sort of like they happen at the same time. Like which comes first, the bowling ball dropping on the mattress or the indent coming from that? It's sort of they interact with each other in a very direct way. Now, that's not to say everyone with gender dysphoria has autism, but a disproportionate amount of people with gender dysphoria do have autism. It is like significantly higher. So the base rate prevalence of autism is around 3% in the general population. And if you look at
So
just the
just because
people,
like 3%, is that like severe? Like these are people who are so obviously autistic that you don't even need a clinician to diagnose this? Because
yeah,
like when I think of autism nowadays, and we know that the rising prevalence of autism, that it also includes people um, who have autistic traits or have
yeah.
some features of autism. But is the 3% like all of that?
So the 3% number is taken from 8-year-olds. So the CDC doing 8-year-old screening at school of them. And so in that 3%, around a third of it is ASD3, or what people might recognize as like a profound autism or something like that. Uh,
Non-verbalism and things.
yeah.
Yeah,
So nonverbal, usually significant intellectual disabilities, things like that. You have ASD2, which is sort of uh, quite affected. High support needs is what it's called, where you're quite affected, but you might not have like an intellectual disability that co-occurs with it, or something like that. And then you have ASD1, which is what I am, what used to be called Asperger's or high functioning autism or PPD-NOS. And so that's like the remaining
the NOS for
25%.
viewers at home who aren't autism scholars.
Uh, oh yeah, pervasive development disorder not otherwise specified. Yeah, so
My
it
kid's weird.
basically,
My kid's a little weird, and I don't know why.
yeah, so there were like specific checks in a box that you needed for autism, or for high functioning autism or for Asperger's, and if you were missing like one or two of them, you would get PPD-NOS. And it's like you've got a lot of it, but we're gonna put you in the PPD-NOS category, or sometimes it's called atypical autism.
Yeah, you're a little off.
And
Yeah.
yes, yes, you haven't quite hit the threshold for Asperger's, but if you were just a little closer, you would get that. So yeah, they like that portion of the population makes up around like 1.5% of the total population at best. 1 to 1.5% of the total population. But within trans communities, it can be up to 20 to 25% of people in the trans community with autism, which is really high when you consider the general prevalence being 1.5% and then jumping up to 20 to 25% in some cases. Some
And
estimates are at like 17%, but it's high. It's at least 10x
yeah, and do we know
the
anything
general
about like the
prevalence.
like between natal boys and natal females? Because my understanding of autism is that it's less prevalent in natal females in the general
Yeah,
population,
yeah.
but in transitioning populations, autism-like behaviors or autism seem especially high in natal females who are seeking transition. And that's just my sort of like
Yeah.
I haven't researched this, but just in talking to people or looking at people's stories and I mean, and some familiarity with like the detransition literature from Kinnan McKinnon, it just seems like like the detransitioners are especially rich.
Yeah, so
In
they're so female detransitioners are especially overrepresented in in autism. From Knut's work, it was like 25% of his sample or something like absurdly high like that. That were on the autism spectrum or had a
That seems
co-occurring.
low even.
yeah, that's,
From the
Yeah,
with the detransitioners I know, all but
yeah,
maybe one are very clearly
yeah,
autistic. You don't need subtle
yeah.
diagnosis.
So I've looked for many detransitioners as part of my data mining, and I found a lot of them, and it was like 80% of them. But that's also
At
because
least.
they're on the internet. They are,
yeah,
a specific type of person, and so my algorithms are going to find them, and so there are selection bias factors
of course, yeah,
in a lot of these things. So it is complicated. But yeah, in terms of natal female to natal male, it seems so in my data set. There is an overrepresentation of natal males compared to natal females, but that is because I look at particularly religious groups and the environmental factors of religion have a way of changing the demographics in that when you go outside of religious environments, the ratios even out. But you also need to take into account that is about 4 times more likely to be found in boys than it is in girls. And so, like, once you correct the ratios, they get sort of closer together, uh, but not when you look at if you look at detransition, it's just wildly skewed female, and especially so it's my numbers for detransition are like 10 to 1, natal female to natal male in autism, and when you consider that there's 3 to 4, it's 3 to 4 times more likely in boys than it is girls, that the corrected prevalence would be like 30 to 1 if you try to account for those like base rate gender ratio differences. And so yeah, it's overall the reasons for it are very complicated. One of the things that is reported by most autistic people is a general sense of being disconnected from your body and disconnected with any sense of gender. There's also a sense in which, so autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental disorder. It starts at a very young age and it's with you forever, basically. And a large part of what gender is and how gender presents is you learning about it, right? You are socialized in your gender and it develops over time. And most of it is indirect and not explicit. And so you aren't, if you are autistic and you're bad at picking up nonverbal, non-direct communication, you are missing a lot of the sort of gender reinforcement signals that that your peers are getting, and you're just dropping a lot of them. And so I don't know, but I would guess that has something to do with the formation of your gender identity or something, whatever you want to call it, as you grow and develop who you are and what your gender is. If you're missing a lot of the nonverbal, non-direct communication, is probably going to end up different from your peers, and you're going to start noticing differences from your peers, and then you're going to start looking for reasons
yeah,
for why you have differences from your peers.
yeah. So
And if one of the solutions is well, the reason is because there is this thing called transgender or gender nonconformity, and this is a normal thing that happens. You go, oh, well, I'm that. Uh, Gender nonconforming traits are very, very high in autistic populations. It is almost universal gender nonconforming behaviors, and that's largely due to a lack of being able to pick up on socialization.
Right, but I think maybe a more pivotal issue is that being gender nonconforming in and of itself, for boys, it's a little bit different. There's
Yeah,
the stakes are a little higher, but for girls, it's just not that big a deal. But if it disturbs you, if your inability to conform and you're getting feedback from people who you want to be your peers that you're not okay because you don't like to wear the right clothes or you're not whatever, then that's going to be distressing, not the gender nonconformity itself.
yeah, yeah.
but
The social reinforcement.
I read
There's
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say there's also just a factor autistic people disproportionately have like issues with eating disorders and body dysmorphia. And I still struggle with both of those things. It's not gender related dysmorphia, but like I am I do powerlifting now as a way to try to mitigate that. But it's the sort of thing I've lived with my entire life. And eating disorders are extremely common in autistic people, especially autistic women, and they are very common in autistic men still. And eating disorders aren't very common in men in
How
general.
how
Yeah.
much is that of that is sensory?
A bunch of it is sensory, right? And a bunch of it is so I have taste and smell hypersensitivity, which sounds cool until you have to live with it. And then you realize it mostly means you are eating bland food. Like I could barely eat cheese. I've never been able to drink alcohol because of the sensory feeling of it. And so there are all these sorts of aspects. And it's sort of like it's a perfect storm of all these different confounding factors that sort of all add up together, right? So you have the socialization, you have natural whatever feelings of disconnection from your body, feeling like commonly expressed like I feel like I'm puppeting a meat skeleton, like I am not my body, I am inside of a body, and just a profound disconnection from that body, lack of social reinforcement from peers, and then just other general things that tend to go along with body dysmorphia and gender dysphoria. Being bullied a lot. Most of us get pretty severely and heavily bullied as teens, and that gives you insecurities about your looks
Yeah.
and how other people perceive you, and so you get like brain worms from that sort of socialization, and so they all kind of come together
Yeah, so I want
is my best guess.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on that because, often when I'm looking at, especially for natal females transitioning, and Yvette kind of alluded to this a little bit, which is like you have a gender role that you're just not functioning well in, and part of the reason you're not functioning well that is because of the autism. It's keeping you from
Yes.
establishing meaningful relationships with people. You don't know how to make friendships. You don't know how to read people's cues to know whether people like you or whether they want to be with you or not. And that same thing happens with autistic boys as well. Like they just like autistic boys probably, unless let's say they're naturally athletic or or naturally, let's say, good looking or maybe not charismatic, but is that they have a hard time functioning in the role of like they see other boys functioning in the role of, of boys becoming men very well. And they struggle with it because they can't form relationships. And I often wonder how often, especially with adolescence, and you had mentioned in your essay that your dysphoria started in adolescence, which is a bit different
Yep.
than mine, but it's a common story. And I think especially common among people with autistic traits because there's this separate, like when puberty hits, that's where the boys become men. And there's a lot of highly gendered behavior that goes along with that. And if you're not picking up on those cues, I'm wondering how often autistic boys get the message of, I just don't know how to do this very well. And when you don't know how to do something very well, it's kind of like, well, what maybe can I do better? Where's my escape hatch here? From from trying to follow the rules of masculinity, and when I fail at them, I'm getting my ass kicked, or I'm getting made fun of, or things like that. And it's like, well, maybe if I could start over in this other life, it would seem to have some allure.
Or to be someone else?
Or to be someone else, just to like, okay, this life ain't working out. I'm getting my ass kicked every day. I have no hope of ever fitting in here. Um, Maybe something different. Women seem nicer. Maybe they'll be nicer to me. Is this kind of a just so story that I'm telling, or is this something that whether
Yeah,
it's
so
up or in your research that you've seen?
I think that is one factor amongst many, right? So I don't think this is a single factor, but I mean it should also be stated that quite a few of the autistic trans women that I know had gender dysphoria starting from a very young age, right? It didn't just onset at puberty. They sort of started when they were like 6 or 7. Like they have early childhood memories and like show me pictures of them dressed up in dresses and things like that.
No, no. My mom could tell you stories.
And
I'm sure.
yeah, right. And so that exists in the autistic populations as well, and also for natal females and everything like that. And so just to be clear, it isn't just those, but for a bunch of us, it does start sort of at puberty or shortly after, or sometime in your teenage years. For those of us who have transient gender dysphoria, it typically starts at around puberty. For if you started to have it before that, it's less likely to be transient.
Yeah.
Just from the data that I have, I'm happy to be corrected on that, but
Like that's my
that's
clinical
generally what I found.
impression as well. Not that I have hard data about it, but just from the people I know and hearing different stories from people mostly online,
Yeah,
it does seem that having an early onset seems to be, if it does persist into adolescence, like we know from there's data that suggests that some kids who are gender incongruent, or a great number of kids who are gender incongruent, it kind of eases and they become primarily homosexual males. But for when it persists past puberty or into puberty, it seems, at least among the people I know who are long-term transitioners and seem to be pretty happy with the path they've chosen, is that that part of the story is fairly common. Not necessarily childhood effeminacy, but definitely
yeah,
childhood attraction to femininity. Um,
yeah. But like I'll also add that there are many cases of autistic people who had started, like, the feelings came when they hit puberty, they transitioned, and
fine.
they're happily
Yeah,
transitioned, and they're glad they did it. And so there are also those cases as well.
yeah. Um, so going through, like I said, like, I love your essay, like I said, and as I said at the beginning, I really do ask everybody to take a moment and read it, especially if you had dysphoria as a teenager, whether it persists or not. It's just a very, like I said, it's a very poignant read because I think anyone who reads it will probably pick out parts of it that resonated. And I just want to focus on one, even though I know it's maybe a little bit peripheral to the conversation. And and I don't know if you frame this necessarily within the context of autism, but it's something that I, as well, maybe within the context of maybe whatever I have that could be described as autism, as this sensation of wondering whether everybody here is going through the same thing as you, and just being really quiet. Like, where's there's a phenomenon called the Abilene Diner paradox. I don't know if you've heard of it, which is it's a story about a whole family who everyone thinks that everybody else in the family wants to go drive out to Abilene, Texas to go to this diner, but nobody actually wants to do it. But because they assume everybody else wants to go, nobody actually raises their voice to say, I don't actually want to go here. And they all go and have a miserable time together, thinking everyone else loved it. You sort of mentioned the story about wondering, and I wondered this as well, is everybody here secretly dysphoric? And all it needs is for one of us to speak up and say something, and it's like, oh, you're feeling this too? Like, we're all dysphoric together. This is just a universal human experience. And it's part of just being a teenage boy, and haha, we're all going to laugh about it later, versus am I the only person in the world feeling this? And is that kind of that like going through that thought process, is this something that is more a dysphoria experience, or is it more of a sort of disordered thinking experience?
I don't know. So for me, I started feeling gender dysphoria, but also, like, I talk about this in the essay. At evangelical Bible camp, they were like, your puberty's going to hit and you're going to start having feelings. They never described what those were, and I, being a very literalistic person who just takes things on face value, went, oh, they were talking about that. That's clearly what they were talking about, and it turns out they weren't. Not everyone has. And I just thought this was a normal thing that everyone went through. And, you're in a fairly conservative evangelical household. So you don't talk about these things in public. You just sort of deal with it and move on. And so I was like, okay, well, I guess this is what they were talking about. And, they would still talk about those things. And I would go, okay, cool. They were talking about, like, lust and things like that, or feeling sexual attraction all of a sudden when you started hitting puberty. I did not understand that that is the only thing they were talking about. And yeah, so there's a story I mentioned in the essay where after I had the dysphoria sort of dropped significantly and I finally started feeling comfortable in my body again. We were sitting in a ditch in a training exercise in the army, and we were just talking, and I said to the guys, they were talking about how weird puberty was, and I'm like, yeah, isn't it weird how you just, like, want to be a girl for a while? And they're like, no, what are you talking about? That isn't a thing. And I was like, yes, classic absurd joke.
Yes.
Yep. Woo. And I was like,
Just
okay,
yeah.
mental note, this is not a universal experience that I'm going through. And so that was when I was like
You didn't
19-ish.
push it like, guys. Guys, you with me here?
Yeah. Well,
All right.
I was expecting them to be like, yeah, isn't that really weird? And they were all like, what the hell are you talking about? And yeah, I only learned that this was a thing called gender dysphoria later on when I started reading the experiences of other trans people online and being like, oh my God, they had that too.
Yeah.
They're still having that. That's weird. But yeah,
At what
yeah.
point were you starting to be able to use the internet to find um, other people with those experiences? Because clearly at 19 you weren't.
Yeah, I mean, I at 19 I was on the internet to play video games and to watch documentaries about World War II. Like that's what I did on the internet between ages 12 to 19. I and you know be on Facebook to talk to my family and whatever. I and so I spent most of my time on history subreddits and forums arguing with people about the various benefits or lack thereof of different airframes in the Second World War. That was sort of my experience. I really had no interest in talking to people about my weird feelings of gender dysphoria because at the time I didn't even know that that was a thing I was supposed that everyone wasn't going through and that I was having a somewhat unique experience.
That part, I'm not saying it doesn't ring true, but it just rings strange to me. And I don't know what, like, once again, is this an autism thing or not? Is that so? Like, I'm older, obviously. I got on the internet for the first time at the age of 22. That's when the first time I was on a computer that was actually hooked up to the internet. I believe it was 1994. And the first thing I did when I got on the internet was like I looked up like transsexual or transgender because I knew like okay there's got to be I want to find out what people are on here and I found like the alt like at that time was bulletin boards. I found this thing called like alt I believe it was alt sex trans was the name of it, which was sort of a bulletin board from the mid 90s where people hung out. And I was thinking, and I've often thought if I was born 10 years later and I got on the internet for the first time at the age of like 12, probably the first thing I would have looked up at that point would have been knowing what my feelings were, would have been like how do I turn into a girl or something equivalent to that. And I'm surprised especially, because your dysphoria sounds probably very similar to my dysphoria, at
Yeah.
least through my adolescence, is how would you have resisted that urge not to be, you obviously were doing it to explore um, World War II
Yeah.
history. Um,
I
um,
so I did that exact thing when I learned about autism for the first time. So when I learned about autism, I went, "Oh, this is me." And I went on a huge deep dive and, found Wrong Planet and all the other autism forums that existed and spent many days on that. The short answer to that question is I was deeply religious and in an environment in which going on the internet to look up things like that is very much not something that you would do.
that was inviting
Um,
that was inviting Satan into your heart, kind of thing.
yes,
Yes.
yes, that would not be something you would be encouraged to do, and that's certainly
Right.
not something that I wanted my parents to find in my browsers. And so,
Right.
you
Control
have the
H isn't always your
yeah,
friend.
Yeah.
yeah, you have these feelings and you just push them down, and you're like, I'm not gonna think about that on the internet because there's no point in thinking about that. It's sinful. You can't do that. No, and so I mean, religious repression is
So,
the
so how
the
much
shortest answer.
how much of that do you think might have been tied to like your eventual like because we often talk about nowadays how the internet is, if not an inducer of dysphoria, definitely an
Yeah.
accelerant of dysphoria.
Oh,
And
for sure.
like a lot of kids maybe they don't have this sort of like this religious mindset of if I type these words out, then God is watching, and this is going to be when I show up in heaven or in purgatory, it's going to be like this is what gets read back to me. The whereas other kids would have been had a hard time resisting that temptation, like I certainly would have.
Yeah,
And if the internet was around when I was 12 and not when I was 22, I have little doubt that I would have been on a transition pathway much earlier than
yeah,
it was because I transitioned in my mid 20s. Um, but even for me in my mid 20s, getting on the internet was an accelerant because it was what helped me recognize that there were other people like me out there. Of course, I knew what dysphoria was by then. I had stolen all the books from the library about it. I had, watched all the daytime talk shows. But once I was on the internet and I actually recognized there are other people who are transitioning who are like me, who are, reasonably successful, not crazy, working in professional, going to, getting master's degrees, et cetera, et cetera. It was sort of like, okay, this is doable. I'm going to do this. And without that, it wouldn't have happened. Um, and and maybe in a world where there's no internet at all, maybe I detransition too, or maybe my dysphoria, maybe my dysphoria waivers or lessons. So how much do you think, like, because I think it's very interesting, and I want to dig deeper into this about your
Yeah.
dysphoria relenting, because if you had asked me before I read your essay, does dysphoria and adolescence in males relent? I would say that is rare as like that's just a super rare outcome. Like people suppress, people dissemble, but
Yeah.
it rarely goes away to a level where it becomes like a non-issue.
Yeah.
Um, your story opened my eyes a bit, and I'm really want to try to understand what do you think is what do you think is why does some dysphoria go away and why does some persist?
Yeah. I mean, I wish I knew the answer to this. I will say if if my dysphoria would have lasted, like if it didn't start subsiding at age 18 and kind of really go down, I would have I would have been all over the internet, right? Especially once I left Christianity, it would have been like that. That would have been the first thing that I would have done when I like finally pulled the plug on Christianity for the first time. That would have been the first thing if I was still feeling dysphoric. But at the time, I just wasn't feeling dysphoric anymore, and I was just like that was a weird part of my teenage years. Um, and so yeah, I wish I could answer that. I like you said, I don't think the internet is dysphoria inducing. I think it's an accelerant. So it can certainly pour gas on the fire that's there, and and so there are a lot of autistic people that I know who had low grade gender dysphoria and were fine with it, and then go into online communities in which they see happy trans people who are living lives that they would want to live, and that takes it from like a small thing that they've been repressing, and then they go, oh, there is actually like light at the end of the tunnel. This isn't a death wish that this isn't a weird
Sorry.
death wish that I have. Yeah,
Yeah.
so I I know people like that as well. But again, it especially for males, it seems random. Like I have not been able to find any good discernible links other than if you had it from like early childhood, it's probably not going to subsist. Whereas if it starts in puberty, who knows? But at the end of the day, the in males, I think it tends to be very different than it does in females for a very wide range of reasons. It seems a lot stronger in males, like the urge or the desire to do it seems a lot stronger in males. And one of the reasons I think that's true is because in the general population, you find a roughly equal number of trans women to trans men. And in the religious population that I have, it's quite skewed to just trans women. And so if it's just skewed to trans women, that means that there are perhaps social factors that are at play here, right? Because they're roughly equivalents, with the only difference being one transitioned and one didn't, or sorry, one being religious and one not. And so there seems to be like a religious repression effect that seems to be more effective on natal women for whatever reason. I don't know why that is.
A
um,
suppression on natal women or suppression on natal men?
well, like being religious
Yeah.
makes you less likely to transition
Yeah.
if you are a woman.
Okay.
Um, whereas if you're a man, the chances that you will transition and also be religious are, much higher.
Yeah.
So
Or give up religion because like
yeah, or give up yeah.
uh,
What I mean is like you're religious when you're like your egg cracks, so to
yeah.
speak.
Because
Um,
like I grew up not super religious, but I'm Jewish. I went to Orthodox Jewish school, and with a lot of those values. And you talked about this too about this sort of being a temptation or a test from God,
yeah,
or and I think and I've talked to other people who either grew up religious where they viewed their dysphoria as an affliction. This is God is testing you in some way.
yep,
This is something you're supposed to resist so that God will reward you for showing your wisdom, your your imperviousness to temptation, and and the other thing with religion too is that the genders are not equal in most
Yeah.
religions. And I've talked about this, I think maybe with a previous pod. I don't know whether my old podcast or this one, but when you are a Jewish boy, there's a prayer you say every day that where you thank God for not making you a woman. Like that's one of the core foundational prayers that you pray every morning. Thank you God for not making me a non-Jew, not making me a slave, and not making me a woman. And so there is this kind of like, why am I being tempted to become the lesser creature? There are a lot of advantages to being male that you're like, why are you giving this up? Not just strength, but like stature that goes along in religious communities. Maybe so it often takes a deconversion. Like I dropped religion at the age of 16, and I never went back. Like I'm traditional, but I never
Yeah.
went back to the religion. But part of it was kind of like part of my understanding. I don't know if you went through a similar thing. Was um, if there was a God who was all loving and all powerful, why would he, who loves me? Why would he give me this to fight? Like it chipped. And I don't know if you went through a similar phase or not.
Yeah. No, I went through a very, very similar phase. And yeah, so I think the fact that you see more male transitioners than you see female transitioners with all of that
Yeah.
baggage on top probably points to the sort of intrinsic urge being a lot stronger in men than it is in women. Not to say that they don't have strong urges at all, but it just seems generally across populations or maybe there's like other factors with like autistic
Sexuality.
rigidity
Yeah.
and stuff like that and sexuality and all sorts of other complicated things that go into that. But yeah, like I mean, I know a lot of religious trans women. I know a lot of religious trans men in my sample set. I talk to them quite a lot. Usually the route they go is not well, like the most common one is full deconversion, right? They just pull the plug on it. If they don't do that, then the most common thing is not to stay in their original religion, but move over to like the Episcopal Church or the United Methodists or like an
Christianity
affirming,
light. Yeah.
yeah, an affirming denomination.
Yeah.
They would probably they would say, no, I'm doing it the right way. This is how it's supposed to be. But it's a more affirming, more liberal denomination that is accepting of them as a trans person. And there's also a lot of like really potentially interesting like Christian theology and Christian eschatology around gender where there's a tradition that spawns from the Cappadocian fathers about how gender is a sort of consequence of the fall and sexual dimorphism is a result of the fall and that in your resurrected, glorified body, the problem of gender dimorphism will be resolved in a way that is satisfying to you. And so there's often that sort of future eschatological hope that your gender incongruence is going to be solved by Jesus or whatever. So there's that factor as well that goes into it. But yeah, the adding religion to it basically skews stats from Gen Pop when you look at like autistic people and their non-religious counterparts.
Our last episode was about autogynephilia, and I was wondering if you've been able to track if autogynephilia is more or less equally common in the dysphoric, autistic religious population than,
Yeah, so
in relation to the general population.
so this is a very difficult question to answer, right? Especially when you're dealing with religious populations, because a lot of them won't admit it, even if it was true, because it's sort of like this would be a very bad thing to admit in your social position, right? And so I I've spoken to a number of autistic trans women who have straight up said to me that they think Blanchardian typology is roughly accurate to describe their experience and that they would be in the AGP camp. I have talked to others who are like, I do not relate to this at all. I do not understand this. This is bunk pseudoscience. And the ones who straight up come out and say, yeah, I have this. This is an accurate description of me. You can be fairly certain they're being honest about it because that's not something that you would readily admit unless you thought it was just true of yourself. But there's like because I'm dealing with self-report, I there are all sorts of factors that you have to encounter. And so like when it comes to AGP related questions, I don't have a whole lot of idea of it based like when compared to general populations, other than I know a few of them, and they are a minority who will explicitly say that they have AGP. Some of them will say like, I understand what they were trying to get at, but I don't think that's a good description of the trans experience. Perhaps this is a small factor in what it is, and like maybe it's a contributing factor or something like that. But very few of them will say, yeah, this is me full blown." Uh,
Right.
Sometimes, but
I,
there's also like a really in the populations that I look at, it's mostly religious people, and so the chances that they would openly admit to this, even if it were true, to a guy that they had just met, uh, probably
true.
lower.
Though I imagine it may leave a fingerprint. Sometimes protesting too much can
Yeah,
be a fingerprint.
I mean,
it becomes unfalsifiable if it's like either you're telling the truth about it or
yeah,
you're lying about it, which is like
yeah,
the very common sort of classic blind Chartesian critique, which is that either you have AGP or you're lying about it. Um,
yeah,
and
exactly.
and it's like are you a witch? Well, let's throw you off the cliff, and if you live, you're a witch.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah,
That's right. And if you weigh the same as a duck, you're made of wood and
yes,
therefore a
yeah,
witch.
yeah.
yeah.
But
And so there are those problems as well, but they're like in general, like what do you even mean when you're saying AGP differs from person to person, right? And so some of them mean it in a strict sense, some of them mean the fact that they like being a woman, and so it's like, well, that's not quite what they're discussing, and so there are those types of problems. At one point, I like you're asking about fingerprints. I've told this story on my podcast, but at one point I was just taking people's media posts and putting them through a machine learning algorithm
yeah,
and trying to classify who is in what category. And one of the features I was looking at was like, can I just by posting style tell if someone is trans or if they're not trans? And the answer was no. You can't very easily, unless they explicitly say as a trans woman in their thing in their posts or something like that.
no one's male coded in your coding.
Yeah. So there is that. But at one point, I found a clustering technique where to sort autistic Christian women from autistic like cisgender autistic Christian women and transgender autistic Christian women. Um, One of them, like one of the techniques that might, when you're doing machine learning algorithm stuff, you're doing feature selection. And so if you're doing feature selection just on images, it will learn to look for a certain type of image in one place that it won't in another. And at one point, it was classifying anyone who posted like an explicit image as being a trans woman because the
Not
number of
wrong.
them that posted explicit images in their social media versus autistic cisgender Christian women who never post anything even remotely like that. So it would like misclassify cisgender women who were doing like OnlyFans work. It would
Say
it
they're
would
trans because they're
it
posting.
would say that they were trans because they were posting explicit images. And so like I don't know if you consider that a fingerprint, but or if you just consider that like a online cultural disposition where the norms of those online cultures are very different in one place than they are in the other. Because in like a cisgender Christian space, doing that would be like anathema. You would get tossed immediately and you would be socially ostracized and like you would never do that. Whereas in online trans spaces, they tend to be far more open about these things. And so, is that actually a fingerprint of something, or are you just looking at cultural discourse norms that are different in transgender spaces than in cisgender spaces? So, it's one of those things where I don't know.
So I want to get back to desistance because this is a really important topic, especially when it comes to sort of pediatric medical care,
Yep.
because I would suspect that a lot of the push behind pediatric medical transition, and the rationale behind it, was based on an assumption that I think I believe to be true, which is that if you have dysphoria in adolescence that is insistent and persistent, however you define that, like didn't just start yesterday, um, the assumption was this is almost certainly not going away, And so if any delay is just another day of masculinization or another day
Yeah.
of prolonging the inevitable. Like why shouldn't you transition at 14 or 15 when you can have a good outcome, presumably? I recognize there's a lot of other factors that go into it
Yeah.
versus waiting till like I did when I was 27 and then you're dealing with, another 12 years of masculinization, which I had to like, recover from.
Yeah.
And the assumption was that if you're dysphoric at 15, you're going to be dysphoric at 25, you're going to be dysphoric at 35, you're going to be dysphoric at 45. And the only difference is when you decide to pull the or how much dysphoria you want to live with before you pull the trigger or before you die with it. Um, you raise this issue, and obviously it happened to yourself. And in your research, you come up with some estimate of how often does this actually happen, where, especially in the male community, because I know the female community, as we were
Yeah.
talking before, is very different. Their motivations for transitioning are very different. They don't have the same sort of arousal triggers. We talked about autogonophilia a little bit. I do suspect, even though we don't have hard numbers on it, that the adolescent onset natal female transitioners probably will detransition or be dissatisfied at a higher rate. Whether that's 5%, 10%, 20%, 50%, I have no idea. But among natal males, the assumption has always been it's a totally different beast. You're dysphoric, you're dysphoric forever. You just got to decide how you're going to live with it. Um, how do you think, do you think there is anything actionable from the research you've done to help inform these questions? Because we just don't have any great data, because generally if you come into a gender clinic, you're going to get affirmed, and you're going to get, usually if you have persistent dysphoria in your male, unless you have horrible comorbidities, you're probably innate treated. So
Yeah.
we actually have no idea what the natural history of dysphoria is in men, and I should say natal males who have dysphoria into puberty. We know if you have it before puberty that many desist, but we don't really know what happens for those who have it in puberty or young adulthood. So how do you think like, maybe tell me a little bit about what you
Yeah.
found and how you think this might inform that discussion?
So around 1 in 3 people that I talk to and do long form interviews with explain to me symptoms that would be classically described as gender dysphoria. It's really high, like 33%. Of
33%
those,
of adult autists
of
describe that?
adult autists that I talk to will say they had an experience that it closely tracks to gender dysphoria. Again,
So,
with
so,
self-report,
so if you would have done this in their training exercise, but happened to be with a cohort of autistic soldiers, you
yeah,
would have got a few
around
little,
one
yeah,
around 1 in 3 of them would be like, yeah,
yeah, of course,
the
yeah, okay.
dysphoria, the teenage dysphoria. No. But so it's about 1 in 3 from my data set. I don't know if this is just rampant selection bias from pulling people exclusively from online communities. Maybe that that taints things. But of those, it's I think 17% that dysphoria doesn't go away after their teens, and they just have it, and the remaining 13%, it sort of starts to go away down to it never fully goes away, right? It just goes down to manageable levels. I
Is
mean,
that
I say it never
meteor?
it never I say it never fully goes away. Maybe it does in some cases, but typically it just like drops to a manageable level where it's like there is no point in me like it doesn't bother me like it used to. So like I'm at that stage where like it doesn't bother me. It's not a big deal. The cost to transition would be enormous.
Yeah.
And so why would I do it?
So
There's just no benefit to
can I
it.
ask a
And so
curiosity question?
yeah, go for it.
Because like, what does dysphoria feel like as someone who's had severe dysphoria but still has it now?
Um, it is the best way to describe it would be like so I had talked about it before how it felt in my teens. Like I felt some like someone had like tattooed an obscene thing on my forehead, and I felt like I had to walk around with that and everyone could see it and I knew that they could see it, and it was this sort of constant psychological pain from having to live with this. Instead of it feeling like someone tattooed someone obscene on something obscene on your forehead, it's more like you have a zit on your forehead or something like that, where it's like, yeah, I wish this wasn't there, but who cares? It's sort of like in an ideal world, I would not have this blemish on my forehead, but I have it. Everyone has it. Who really cares? I don't really care. I'm just gonna power through this and pretend it's not there. That's the best way I can explain it. Where it's like, you look in the mirror and you're like, don't love what I see, but whatever, I have a human body. And these are just effects that come about as having a human body. And so like I don't feel I know what severe gender dysphoria feels like. I don't feel that anymore, or anything even remotely close to it. And so that's the sort of best way I can approximate it.
So reconciling the zit on your forehead is a maturity thing. And I don't want to imply at all that um, uh, easing dysphoria is a sign of maturity. I don't mean that at all. But in your case, do you think there was any cause and effect
Yeah,
of
I mean,
your reconciling what was going on?
I think just like throughout my life, I've had to deal with problems much bigger than worrying about specific cosmetic issues that I have, and so it's like there are people dying right now. There are worse things happening in the world than my petty concerns. I'm just gonna sort of put those behind me and stop, just stop thinking about myself as much. Stop. It's like classic CBT style thinking. Now, I'm not saying CBT will resolve gender dysphoria. It won't at all. It but thinking like, okay, is this actually a big deal? Do other people actually see this in me? Or am I being a little irrational right now? I'm probably just being a little irrational right now. This is probably not how other people see it or how other people deal with it. And again, since it is sort of a small amount compared to what it used to be, it's easy to sort of rationalize yourself out of it versus like I have said, and I will say it again, if I still felt this at age 22, I would have pulled the trigger and transitioned. Like it is a profound psychological discomfort.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, no doubt about that.
and I just like, yeah, I 0 out of 10 experience would not recommend.
Yeah,
But once it stops being a profound psychological discomfort and just becomes minor psychological discomfort, everyone has psychological discomforts about everything. And you just treat it like another one of your psychological discomforts that you have. And like, if you were bit by a dog as a child, and so you're not super fond of dogs, but now you're an adult, you can be more normal about it, I guess.
Well,
Is Yeah.
some people are. Um, what like speaking with some of my friends who have detransitioned, for them, what had one of the things that made their dealing with their dysphoria and then it's going away easier was finding some purpose or doing things in life. I mean, you're describing it as easing around 18 by 19. You're just kind of checking in with the guys, to see, assuming that other people feel it too. Had you created, like, were you like out of high school and then doing something new? How old were you when you joined the military? Was there some other structural thing happening in your life that may either correlate or may have helped the process?
Yeah, I mean, I think joining the military probably did something to me. You go from a fairly low stakes life as a guy going to high school, and then you're thrown into a situation where people are yelling at you and you're in like survival mode all the time, and you are having to deal with the reality that you are going to be killing people or people are going to be killing you. And just a lot of my attitude shifted. With that being said, I know a lot of autistic men like me who joined the military,
yeah,
and it did not,
makes
it
sense.
had the exact opposite effect, right? It just
Interesting.
ran the feelings of dysphoria that they had just rammed through the roof, right? Because
Why?
well, the way they report it to me is they go, I had these feelings. I knew I had these feelings. And so I was like, how I'll deal with these feelings? Going to the most masculine place possible. And then you go to the most masculine place possible, and you're like, I kind of hate masculinity. This sucks, right? And then there's also just like military related service trauma where you're with a bunch of guys and it's all men, and you're seeing some of the most horrible stuff you've seen in your life, and you start associating masculinity with death and suffering and with these types of things as well, and that makes your dysphoria much worse, right? So I do digital forensics. A lot of people doing digital forensics get increased gender dysphoria because you see men do things that are not great,
Yeah.
and that makes you have some pretty negative feelings towards masculinity, right? Like you start going, okay, maybe Andrea Dworkin made some good points here.
It's not even negative feelings, like, because obviously I had some of the, I wasn't in
Yeah,
the military, but I had, I was on, I played, like, not high level sports, but reasonably high level
yeah,
sports. And, when you're in a team with men, you sort of recognize, like, there's something about me that's very different from
yeah,
men function.
yeah.
And
And I had that exact same
yeah,
feeling in the military.
yeah,
Like going into the military, I was like, oh, I'm not like these guys. But for me, I also had the explanation of autism, right?
yeah,
I went, I'm not like these guys, and it's because I have autism. And so that's why I'm naturally different. If you don't have that explanation, I could easily see myself being like, well, maybe I'm not a guy.
but
Maybe
it's not
this
that
is
even that I'm not a guy. It's like I don't want to be a guy.
exactly,
It's
exactly.
just that being part of that team implies. Because
Yeah,
people, part of the reason, like I'm saying, people like me transition is not just like, we've had these conversations before. It's like, why couldn't you just be a more feminine guy, or why couldn't you just be a nice guy, or whatever it is, like, whatever feminine characteristics I had as a male, like, why couldn't I just lean into those? And it's like, I just don't want to be on that team. And I'm not saying I was the only motivator, but it was sort of a
yeah,
recognition of there's something clearly, clearly, uh, clearly different about me. The when we talk about sort of, you talk about your description of dysphoria, and I think, like, part of what I'm trying to do, I'm not just doing my own psychoanalysis, my own purpose, but once again trying to understand what is it about people who desist versus people who persist. And you describe your dysphoria as being sort of like the sense of, like, people can see that I'm different and I don't want to be different. It's a bad feeling when people think you're different. Whereas I always thought about it like anytime I had even a aliquot, even a quanta of exposure to femininity, it made me insanely upset and jealous of a life that was passing me by. Of like, here are these people who are effortlessly
yeah,
having femininity, and here I am stuck in this ugly body, in this ugly role, and these people just have this thing that I
yeah.
want.
I
Um,
mean that was a major part of it for me as
yeah,
well. It just like I mean for me, I I made friends with a lot of women, and I sort of realized the grass wasn't greener on the other side, I guess.
fair.
But in high school, I didn't have many female friends at all. I had sisters, but I and I had a lot of, in the essay I talk about how like there was a large part of it that was just a fascination with femininity and with those types of things. And so like to this day, I still have that to a large degree. Like my Twitter followers, 50% of them are women, which is very weird given
Yeah.
that Twitter is not 50-50, and that I'm a man. Most of the people I hold close friendships with are autistic women, and I find the experiences of women very fascinating and very interesting. And one of my most of the authors that I read are women, and I I find them very interesting just from like a clinical perspective, I guess. Like there, it's sort of shifted in me where it went from like I'm jealous that I don't have this to more like I find this interesting
Hmm.
to observe and interesting to think about, right? Like I've read a lot of second wave feminist literature, and most of my autistic women friends are sort of rad fem or rad fem adjacent, or in some capacity one of those things. And it's because I find those topics very interesting, and so I don't think that aspect ever really went away. It just shifted to clinical detached interest instead of desire to be in that role, if that makes sense.
So one thing, and this is probably interesting, to Yvette as well, is, and we were talking about it, I know, before we started taping, is about sort of the like turfiness. Uh,
Yes.
I know it's not, or gender criticality, but like the kind of people who I, as a online advocate, um, am having interactions with on a regular basis, are people who are, the sort of colloquial term of the ultra turf or the ultra GC, who will give absolutely no quarter to, I recognize like the trans experience is quite heterogeneous, and but I'm someone who, I'm not saying I'm better or worse than anyone else, but like, whatever. I've lived in this role for 25 years. I've done, I think, an okay, job of it, and I don't know, just by saying I've done an okay job of it is causing ultra GCs to flinch. Like they're probably rolling around their beds right now just hearing those words having been spoken. But one of the things you mentioned is that you have found, or you sense, and even if you haven't done formal
Yeah.
testing on it, that there's a lot of autistic type um, elements among the
Yes.
kind of people who are in this ultra turf group. And obviously,
Especially in online discourse.
especially in online discourses. Um, but would you say that even goes as far to apply, like I said, I know we don't want to diagnose individual people, but even some of the people who are, let's say, the real big players in turfdom. Um, um, do you get the sense that autism or autistic type thinking is a driving force behind that? Or is it just like, yeah, it's just perfectly reasonable, you don't need to be autistic to be gender critical or to be that gender critical.
So you don't need to be autistic to be gender critical or to be that gender critical. However, it does seem to help. I'll say that, right? Like it isn't a prerequisite, but autism, I often
Gives
describe
you
it
the
as an
biologic
accelerant.
advantage of being a turf, or even as being a trans is
Yeah, it gives you I describe it as an accelerant, right? Like it tends to push us towards poles. So I often joke that autism is a set of bimodal distributions because there's a joke from this autism documentary about an autistic comedy troupe, and one of them says, you never see an autistic person jogging. They're either walking or sprinting. There's no in between. And that is, so wherever you get hardline beliefs and people who are very principled and committed to the cause, you're going to find a disproportionate amount of autistic people because, what puts you there? Black and white thinking, highly principled behaviors, a belief that you are right and a need to correct other people. You could just list off a set of autism
yeah,
symptoms
not
and
taking the
and
social
you'll
cues of the conversation
yeah,
as over, and we need to move on to other things.
yeah, exactly,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah, trauma
And
is a factor.
yep,
PTSD also shows as black and white thinking. And some
yep,
some of the people who I'm familiar with who are really hardcore ultras, I'm not even interested in the hardcore
yeah,
ultras, that they have other mental health issues,
yep,
generally broadly based in trauma.
yep. And another thing to keep in mind is that one thing that motivates a lot of people on the gender critical side, especially from the research that I've done, is a proximity to sexual violence.
Hmm.
It just a big factor in a lot of their motivations is a proximity to this type of thing. When I talk to them, this gets brought up a lot, right? It is one of the most commonly mentioned things, and autistic women tend to have a much closer proximity to sexual violence than most other women. The chances that you will be assaulted if you are a autistic woman are significantly higher than if you are not an autistic woman for a lot of
Wow.
reasons.
Like for the
Um,
general population, it's already very high for
Yeah.
it
women.
is it is shockingly high when you look at it for autistic women. Uh, there are a bunch of stats that go around, but it's something like 70 to 90%
Wow.
um, between those. Especially when you can't read social cues and you can't read the social cues of men, you don't see red flags that other women see. You are missing the things. So there's that factor as well that
Right,
comes
right.
into
And
it.
most of us, most women by 11, 12, 13 already have the experience
Yep,
of inappropriate sexual attention from men.
yep,
And the autistic girls aren't going to catch it as well. But that would
yep,
be a part of the vigilance.
Yep, and they catch it, and it is an extremely jarring experience for them in a lot of ways. I mean, especially the religious ones. So the religious ones, I find, you know, go gender critical pretty easily, and they go gender critical pretty easily because it doesn't take a whole lot to convince them that there's something going wrong with men, and that there are issues with men, and they go, well, trans women,
This is one of the
they're
issues.
yeah, yeah, they're men, so why would I make an exception for them is basically what you get there, and it's just a sort of pervasive thing that comes up with them. Like a lot of the women that I interview aren't even out gender critical. They just sort of
They
stealthily
know
hold the
better.
views. They
Yeah.
they especially if they're in more progressive circles. A very common phenomena that I find is I'll interview someone, and then they'll give me a set of answers where they're sort of like mostly trans inclusive in what they say, and then like 6 months later, after talking to them more and after they get to know me better and they learn that I'm sort of dead inside and don't care what they say and won't be affected by it at all, they'll start to sort of let the mask slip a little and reveal to me their true power level. It happens a lot. It and I I often had a joke that like if you meet a religious autistic woman, give it 6 months and then ask again about what she actually thinks about trans people, and you will get some different answers.
So,
Many of the times they're willing to be accommodating, like they're like, I'll go along with it, whatever. Like I'll use the correct pronouns and things like that if this is what you want. But they maintain a level of vigilance that would not be accepted by most people, I'll say.
oh, well, I mean, and with good reason that they're really
Yeah.
vigilant about it, especially if they've already run into a lot of rejection for accidentally saying the wrong thing.
Yep. But
But
then
one,
you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
oh, I was going to say that reminded me, I was curious because I was listening to your podcast and like, how do you define inclusion and anti-trans? Because from listening, it seemed really, really strict. But even within the trans community, you won't find, I don't know, um, if we, I don't know if you would call some trans people anti-trans because they
Yeah.
might have one opinion
Oh,
here
some trans would
and
call
then
me anti-trans. So
Yes.
just the fact that I'm talking to you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really difficult, right, to fully answer that because what is anti-trans? Is it
well,
anti-trans
to you, what is
to
anti-trans?
to me personally, I
Yeah,
would I would say um you would have to be like overt about it. Um is the best way to put it. To be anti-trans would to basically not recognize a trans person as the gender that they are presenting as, I think. So if you sort of put you on the spot, Laura, but if you were to say Laura's not a woman, I would consider that anti-trans, right? Like I would say, yeah, that you're probably anti-trans. Again, it's not one of those things that has like a strict definition because there are, if you say, okay, you're not a woman, but I'll use your pronouns, I'll use your given name, and for all intents and purposes, I will play the game or whatever. This is
right.
typically how
Well,
they describe it. They sometimes they'll use the allusion to Paul writes in one of his letters that about eating the meat sacrificed to burnt or to idols. They will explicitly use that framing to say, I will go along with the cultural convention for the sake of these people. But is that person anti-trans? I don't know because functionally they're not. Ideologically they are.
but someone can't help that if they
Yeah,
don't believe that. You like we
right.
can't
So
will ourselves to believe something we don't.
Yeah.
yeah,
Like I don't
I
actually care if Yvette thinks
yeah
I'm a woman or not. Um, and
yeah
that's not just specific to Yvette. That's just like I don't care.
Sure.
Like what I care is like what matters to me is that I have some legal protections as a woman.
Yeah.
And whatever someone individual thinks of it, like I hope that, like whatever Yvette thinks about whether I'm a woman or not, she seems to be she's kind to me, and that's I'm happy and I'm happy with that, and I don't want to force Yvette to believe necessarily that I'm a woman, but I'm also not going to, if someone asks me, do I think I'm a woman, I'm going to say yes, and I don't care if Yvette's sitting beside me. I think the thing with like, am I anti-trans or not? Because I think there's a lot of different ways you could, it's gradations, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
different ways you can be it. Like some people will be like, I have trans people in my family, but I don't think they should be playing sports, or I don't think they should be
Yeah.
um, changing in the change room, or whatever it is. And someone would say that's anti-trans, and someone would say that's common sense. And you know, I don't know. I don't think it's like worth getting into. Like for me, it's like, are you trying to kill me? Are you trying
Yeah.
to are you trying to make my life harder than it needs to be? And then the other one is just like, are you judging me on the basis of group membership as opposed to as an individual when I am giving you individual data to work with? Um, in a sense of like, not that I'm giving you a spreadsheet, but I'm
Yeah.
giving you like, you know who I am and what I'm
Yeah.
about. Like, it's one thing to like hang out with me for an hour and say, well, you're clearly a man. And it's like, well, I don't know. Versus, anyways, I know we're going off on
Yeah.
a tangent, a little purity testing here, but
It's
yeah,
a very hard question to answer. Because my instinct to initially answer it is to say policy. Like what policies will you vote for? But then again, it's like, okay, well, are if you vote against a sports bill, but you vote for housing and legal protections, is that anti-trans? Some people would say yes,
yeah.
right? And so it's a very difficult thing to answer. I will say in the populations that I study, um, they tend to be quite forthright about their positions once you get to know them, and so there is less gray in in whether or not they are anti-trans when you actually start to talk to them.
And
But
I,
yeah,
I find it a difficult space sometimes to navigate because I'm a nuanced person,
yeah,
and which is obviously something that is not my most autistic trait.
yes.
Um,
Well,
and
and some autistic people like myself, I am like a hyper nuanced person,
okay, everything
and
is black and
some some of us black and white think our way into being hyper nuanced.
white.
Um,
You're either hyper
but
nuanced or you're not. Yeah,
well, you because you're so black and white in your thinking and you're like, okay, well, this doesn't actually fit into this category because it doesn't meet all of these criteria. So it needs to go into another category. And
yeah.
so instead of having like black and white thinking, you just have lots of different tiny boxes that you hyper systematize things into. And so it looks very nuanced. One of the jokes about my podcast is like a used car salesman hitting the top of a car and saying, "This bad boy can fit so many caveats into it." Because if you've listened to some of my episodes, like I'll spend 30 minutes giving caveats about the data before I actually talk about what the data is. But yeah, so yeah,
So you say in the essay that in retrospect, you're glad that you didn't medically transition at the time of your distress.
yes,
Um, but today things are different. How would you feel about a child that you love who was having distress? Would you How would you feel about starting the process of medical transition?
yeah. So this is a question that I actually get an enormous amount. I'm sort of like the guy that a lot of people come to, and especially because I deal with Christians, they tend to not be the most in favor of transition for reasons I don't think I need to explain on this podcast. But generally speaking, they're not for it, and so they go to people looking for help for who who knows what I'm supposed to say to my autistic son, and then eventually they get redirected to me, and I have to walk and talk them through this question, and so it's far less abstract than perhaps I would like it to be, because this is something I deal with a lot. So ultimately, there are so many variables that you have to consider that I would say I'm not going to give you generic advice. So I have a phrase that I say a lot, which is there are no silver bullets, like there are no one size fits all solutions. Every case is going to be different, and every case is going to turn out differently. What I would say is that there are different paths that people go down, and I'm not exactly sure why they go down these paths, but you should be aware that in a lot of cases, we have some pretty simplistic narratives around transition, or on the other side, you have simplistic narratives about, people who didn't transition and then turned out fine. And the reality is nothing is that simple. People are very complicated. The brain is very complicated, especially when you get something like autism. Autism is a broad heterogeneous condition that has very different presentations in different types of populations. And so, like, I would need so much more data before I tried to give an accurate description of what I thought would happen. I Their age would also matter a lot. So, depending on what age they were, if they were in their 20s, I would say, yeah, this probably isn't going to go away. So you need to do with this whatever you will. But if they
Yeah.
were in if they were 12, I would say, hey, maybe understand that these in about like half the cases of people, they end up getting over their dysphoria, and half the cases they don't. And which one you're in, I don't know. And it's one of those difficult things, right? Because if this is something you're going to live with your entire life, do you want to be one of those people who significantly delays transition? Or do you want to, living with dysphoria sucks. It is very hard, it is very difficult, and it is psychologically taxing to a level that I can't explain very well to people. Like it's one of those things where you just have to be there, right? Like you have to have experienced it. I in the essay I tried to give like a metaphor of what it feels like, but even that feels not quite right. Like it doesn't quite get it. And so if you're saying don't transition, you're basically telling someone you need to start living with this profound psychological distress for a very long time. And so, like, yeah, like I said, this is a very non-answer. I recognize that, but the reason it's a non-answer is because this is very complicated and there are so many variables. So some of the variables that make it more complicated are confounding mental health conditions. So, if they have no other mental health conditions, that would lead me more to be like, okay, this probably won't desist. But if they have a lot of confounding mental health conditions, I would say, well, maybe deal with those first, or try to get your house in order before you make any massive life altering decisions,
Right.
and
Though
that
that's
type of
not
thing.
the practice today.
Yeah, I mean,
That the dysphoria, many people report to me the dysphoria diagnosis then becomes primary to anything else
yeah, that
that's
so
happening.
I've talked to quite a few detransitioners, and one of the reasons they transitioned is because they had a lot of co-occurring mental health conditions, and they were told that transition was going to be a magical silver bullet that was going to solve all their problems, and then it ends up not solving those problems because it turns out transition is very good at solving one problem, and that problem is gender dysphoria. It is not good at solving other problems. Now, if those other problems are downstream of gender dysphoria, sure, it will probably have some knock-on effects, but transition is not a cure-all magic silver bullet that's going to solve all your problems. And so, I also would caution people on that. And yeah, so
And
maybe
like picking up on that a little bit because like I know like this is a very common narrative that's out there as far as and there is truth to it that when at least and to the extent that it's occurring right now in mid 2020 or early 2026 because I think clinicians are like it or not they are adjusting a bit is that when people were affirmed and there's predominantly an affirmative model um, you know it's hard to know what clinicians actually because we don't have microphones in the room what clinicians actually say and what the patients hear.
yeah,
And I bring to this because, like, I'm a clinician myself. I'm not a gender clinician,
yep,
but I have many times been in a situation where I explain a story, like, or explain a disease and a syndrome and expectations, as I've done hundreds and hundreds of times. But patients come in with their own values and their own anticipation of what you're going to say, and they'll often apply their own values to what you say and kind of really pay attention to the parts that fit with their own narrative and pay less attention to the parts that don't fit with their narrative. And it's often hard to know, like, what you say, but you don't always know what someone's hearing and which
yeah,
parts that they really kind of focus on and which part of it gets filtered out. And so I always wonder, especially with people who are more autistic, so if you're an autistic person, you have dysphoria, you have gender incongruence, you go to a clinician, the clinician, let's say, is giving you a shared decision-making type of explanation, or a more sort of like, well, this can happen, this might happen, there's bad things, there's good things, like something with nuance. That a person who is more autistic might just glom on to the kind of things that are, this is what works and this is what doesn't, or this is what I want, so this is what I'm going to pay attention to. And I often wonder, especially in these people who do transition later, who often come back with this narrative of, well, the doctor told me it was going to make my whole life better, is how much, what parts of this, what parts were really heard and what parts were kind of filtered through. And I don't know if
Yeah,
I don't know, as someone who's experienced with autism, both as a lived experience and someone who studied a lot, um, does that make sense? Or,
yeah, I think it does. So there's a problem that I talk about quite a bit with autism, which is the problem of unreliable narration, which is so all those factors come in, but also I don't, people say 80% of communication is nonverbal or not spoken. And I'm missing like 80% of that in most conversations that I have. And so the conversation you're having with me often isn't the conversation you think you're having with me because yeah, and I'm very bad at like projecting my own body language to communicate things to you, and so the conversation you think you're having with me might not be the one. Like typically the conversation I'm having is the literal words coming out of my mouth without much thought about tone or body language or how people understand it. And that is often not the conversation that people think they're having. So there's that factor as well. There's also like another factor which isn't before the patient gets to the clinician to have that discussion, they usually they aren't coming to the doctor only having heard of gender dysphoria from the doctor, right? They've heard about it a lot in online communities, and online communities, especially online communities that tend to, just in general, online communities are pretty black and white and like simplistic narratives. Uh, Communities that are saturated with autistic people tend to tend to like them even more and like to have very solid answers and this is what the science says when that is in fact not what the science says. It is a reoccurring problem with my autism research where autistic people get ideas about what is and is not autism, and the literature and existing data sets that we have do not back that up, but it was said in a community and that sort of becomes the new truth.
yeah,
And so they're having a conversation with a clinician already pre-primed to think about things and to hear things a certain way.
yeah,
And so there's also that factor where you could have a you could have a negligent clinician who does not do their due diligence and who does not do a thorough job, and who there is recently a really big lawsuit
yeah,
about that
healthcare
where
ethics, yeah,
yeah, yeah, and so those cases absolutely exist, but there are probably going to also be cases in which you heard what you wanted to hear, or you misunderstood what was being said, or you came in with a preset conclusion, and especially in places where doctors are seen as the evil gatekeepers, that this is the person trying to keep you from your miracle cure to solve all your problems, and so you just say whatever you need to say to get it done. There are those factors as well. So I the reports I get are often varied, and a lot of times there does seem to be clinician negligence, but also there are places where I could very easily see a scenario in which there was no clinician negligence. They were doing what they thought was best and what was in line with best practices and like a normal, robust
at least as understood at the
methodological
time,
approach.
yeah,
Yeah, at least as it was understood at the time. And it just didn't work out that way. And so I could see that too. But yeah, it's a very complicated space, right? Because you're basically dealing with self-narrated report from an event that usually happened like 3 or 4 years ago, and just your own perceptions of what happened and what actually happened can be quite different. Uh, I work in forensics. One of the biggest things that we see all the time is people self-report not aligning with the evidence that we find on a computer. Someone computers record things pretty diligently in a certain sequence, and it's you can mess with those sequences and you can upset them or delete things. But generally speaking, I'm less confident in the human mind's ability to accurately recreate sequences of events as
Yeah,
they
yeah,
actually happen.
we're forgetful, and we're also very motivated reasoners, and yeah,
Yes.
yeah. So
Yeah.
anyone who does,
Yeah.
Right,
retrospective
right.
research knows that.
And we recreate memories as we remember them again and as we
Yeah.
relate them again. But then also in these cases, there are letters and records, medical records, um, that leave a paper trail.
Yeah.
So it's not just what people
Yeah.
say.
Yeah. But I mean, in the cases where I talk to them, I don't have access to any of that, so I'm just going off of what they say and going like, okay, cool.
Yeah, and
That
we all
that
and we
makes
all
sense.
have a habit. And I don't think this is unique to autists, to people with
No.
autism, of creating the best version of ourselves.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's not surprising that everyone wants to be either the hero in their own story or the victim of their own, the worthy victim. And and like I say, this is not something that's unique to detransitioners. This is anyone who's going on a first date, or maybe years later in divorce court. There people are going to try to give the best version of themselves. But you know, this really been not just a fascinating conversation, but it's been a fun conversation for a heavy topic. And I really want to thank you for your openness and for doing the work you do and for thinking the way you think. Um, because I think, like I said, that there, I'm not going to say it's not often people make me think. Obviously, people make me think a lot, but this was really something different than what I usually read, and a different perspective than what I usually read. And I'm not saying it's like made, like it's turned my life around 100%, but it's really made me a lot more thoughtful about things that maybe I wasn't as thoughtful about before. And I want to thank you for that. And I want to thank you for joining us here today, because
Yeah.
this was a fabulous conversation. I don't know, Yvette, if you have any last words uh, before we let John get on with his life.
Oh, I just love that you're doing this kind of work and that you're collecting so much data in so many different ways and working to make sense of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It was good talking to you guys.
Yeah.
Good talking to you too.
You too. Have a great night, and thank you once again for joining us on the podcast. So that was good. That was like another great conversation. Like, I know like John is like uh, doing fabulous work, maybe not a widely known name, but he has a story to tell. Like I said, I'm just super fascinated by, and I'd love to meet more people like him, because it's really a they're by the grace of God go I. Like, I'm just wondering, like, what are the kind of triggers, or what are the kind of doors that I moved through or didn't go through that would have left me where John is. Like, and I've said this before, like, I love my life. Like, I have a great trans life, but it is a trans life, and that goes with it a lot of annoyances,
Sure.
a lot of inconveniences, and that I wouldn't have to deal with if I had a path to desisting and living. Like, I tried to, he didn't describe it necessarily in a way that resonated with me, in terms of like, what does it feel like? I often wonder, like, what would it feel like to live with low grade dysphoria at my age, or at all the years leading up to my age, and what would that have, how would I, like, what would have been like, as opposed to full on repressing. um
Right, right.
um
That really is quite different
yeah,
because then when you repress it, it comes out sideways.
yeah,
But if it's the pimple on your head and you're like, well, there it is. Who doesn't have a pimple on their head?
yeah. Yeah, and so like I'm still working my way to trying to understand or feel what he's feeling, because I have a hard time, like, if I try to close my eyes real tight and I try to think of like what would be like to live with mild dysphoria, where maybe I thought about it once a month, or maybe it was mild, and I knew as long as I didn't do X, Y, and Z, as long as I didn't go down too many internet, like if I spend too much time on Twitter, like reading, like for me, it was like reading trans blogs at the time. Like that was my porn, in a sense, was reading,
Sure,
was reading blogs of middle of 20-ish, of 20-ish, 30-ish women who were transitioning or just transitioning, whose lives were similar to mine, and being like, wow, what an adventure she just had. She just kissed her first boy. She just went to work for the first time. She's traveling. She's going on a trip to Japan. She's doing all these things as a woman and having these experiences, and I'm just here reading about it. Um, that was my accelerant. And obviously, like, if I avoided that somehow, like, maybe I would just be kind of like, whatever. I get this feeling every once in a while, and people have this, whatever. But I've got this great guy life. Here's my wife. Here's my 3 kids. Here's my big house. Here's my career. Here's vacationing with the family. Here's like all the, all the good things that, like, straight cis people get to enjoy. And I kind of wonder about, like, well, how could my life have been different, and would it have been so bad? Um, anyways.
Right, right. And we can't know, like for him, what other variables were in there that there was a tipping point for him to go past. I don't know that everyone's tipping point is that close to where they are.
Yeah, no, like yeah, like I don't like everybody like he kind of said at the beginning like everybody's story is their own story. Like even when he's giving that advice, it's always individualized. Like sure he had dysphoria, he describes it as severe dysphoria, but just like I don't know what color red he sees. I don't know what his severe dysphoria was compared to my severe dysphoria, and I don't know what my severe dysphoria is to someone else who maybe transitioned when they were 17, and or 12, and because obviously I was able to shove it in a box for a long time, or for a reasonably long time. And so like you never really know what anyone else is feeling or what their dysphoria is. And he says himself, like it's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. It's like, they have those contraptions that make you feel like menstrual cramps. That I don't know if you've seen these things. They often give them to teenage boys so they can sympathize with what girls are feeling, and it kind of shocks, makes your muscles tighten so it feels like menstrual cramps. Not that I would have any idea, but
But you know what cramping feels,
what
abdominal cramping
yeah,
feels
sure,
like.
I know what
Yeah,
cramping feels like, and I can imagine, yes, it's a little lower down, and yes, I've had cramps in that area too, and but whatever. I'm not going to caught to knowing what that.
sure.
But you never know what anyone else actually feels when they feel a thing. Just like you never know when someone says that looks red to me. It, are those photons hitting your eyes the same way? So like yeah, so in the end, like I there's something very tantalizingly close to talking to someone like that to know like what does this feel like, but it's still like just beyond my reach to understand that, even as someone who's experienced dysphoria, and imagine even more so for someone who hasn't experienced dysphoria, because like a lot of the gender criticals, like like there's a part of me that says if only you experienced dysphoria for a day, um, you would you wouldn't be so mean to me.
Right, right. I think that so many of the conversations that people go around and around in, which, I've been seeing them go around and around for, I don't know, almost a decade now, at least, if not more, that they've we've all, I think, lost the grounding, or many people have lost that particular grounding. Like, okay, my issue here, not me, but if I were speaking in shoes like yours, my issue is this crushing, unmanageable feeling that is not going away on its own.
yeah,
And when people are like, God damn it, get out of my bathroom or whatever, there that those things don't even reach.
yeah.
Um, yeah,
I think also I
which
recognize
is
that
which is
the
why
reason
I
that
like these.
yeah,
I like these
yeah,
conversations
yeah,
because we can get past that round and round and round,
yeah.
even if we touch on the round and
Yeah,
round.
and I recognize like a lot of the people feel that way is because they think whatever is driving that intense feeling, whatever it is some sort of perversion underlying it, uh,
Right, and there's
or some sort of damage to the soul. That.
right, right. And you've mentioned on X, and I think I saw something earlier today or yesterday, just mentioning that the trans women who get the most media attention are unhinged.
Oh yeah,
They're behaving badly. They're the Lily Tinos and oh, Jessica Yaniv and all of that.
yeah, yeah,
And so um, people lose the nuance that they are not really representative. They're out there. They exist.
yeah, and we
Um,
and we and we see like that. There are trans people behaving badly, whether it's Jessica Yanoven or antics, or whether it's people who are actual predators or molesters or
right.
or pedophiles or what like those people exist, but because those stories get platformed and they're lurid, they catch people's eyes. It's like it's easy to think that's what all trans people are because that 2% or 1% of trans people gets 98% of the attention.
Right. And then the laws say, well, if this unhinged person says they're a woman, then absolutely, they can make a video of themselves in the women's room,
Yeah,
at Disney World. The laws don't protect, they don't protect us.
yeah. No, I get the sentiment. Like I obviously I'm upset when I'm
Sure.
on the losing end of that. As
Right, right.
someone, like as I say, I want to be judged as an individual. I'm not someone, I'm not a pervy person. And and I recognize just by the virtue of being trans, everyone's always going to think, well, there's some perversion in there somewhere. Yeah, just got to, cut the, it's like there's the witch and there's him. We know you're a witch. If you're trying your enough, it's going to come out. I get it. But I don't know. Anyways, I'm really glad we had John on. And like I said, I'm still lining up guests for our next episode. But hope you join us next time. Any last words, Yvette?
Um, I really enjoyed talking to John. I'm glad you found him. I had no idea he existed.
Yeah,
And I'm doing searching too.
good.
I have some emails out and conversations out to find people to bring in for
Yeah.
interviews too.
Fascinating guests with a story to tell, whatever it is. I'd love to hear from them. And yeah, no, it was really wonderful. Anyways, thanks for joining.
Thank you.